This is really tough for me to talk about. Even after all these years, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. I've never really shared this story, not even with my family, and certainly not with the friends who lived it with me. We all agreed, without really saying it, that we would just bury the memory as deep as we could. But lately, it's been haunting me, clawing its way back into my thoughts, and I guess I just need to get it off my chest. I grew up in a little suburb outside one of Pennsylvania's largest cities. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever really happens. But despite its proximity to the city, it's got a small town vibe that I've never really loved. I'm more of a wilderness guy, a country boy at heart, just like my two best friends, Kevin and Kyle. Most people call Kyle Buddha because of his Zen-like attitude towards everything, except his parents. They insist on calling him by his birth name. Kevin, Buddha, and we were inseparable since middle school. We played football together, fished together, and made it through the roller coaster of high school side by side. Knowing that we'd all be heading off to different colleges at the end of the summer, we decided to have one last hurrah, one final adventure to cap off our years of friendship. We planned a camping trip to a place we'd never been before, the vast, sprawling wilderness of the Allegheny National Forest. We left early on a Friday morning, our truck loaded down with camping gear, fishing rods, a cooler full of food and beer, and, reluctantly, our cell phones. Because, of course, our parents wanted to make sure we could call for help if we got into any trouble. The irony wasn't lost on us. If we really got into trouble, we'd be too far out for anyone to reach us quickly. But we took them anyway, to keep the peace at home. The drive was long, about 4 hours, filled with pit stops and the usual antics you'd expect from three guys about to part ways for the first time in their lives. We talked about our future, joked about our fears, and reminisced over high school dramas and triumphs. By the time we reached the Allegheny, we were ready to disconnect from everything except the nature around us. We drove deep into the forest, way past the marked camping areas. We were looking for isolation, a place where we could really feel like we were out in the wild. Eventually, we found the perfect spot, a clearing right by a lake, secluded and beautiful. We set up camp quickly, tent, fire pit, everything in place. Then we grabbed our fishing gear and headed for the lake. It was a perfect day for fishing. The sun was shining, the lake was calm, and the fish were biting. I managed to catch a couple of bass, which we decided to cook up for dinner. As the evening settled in, we sat around the campfire, eating our catch and sharing stories. Some funny, some scary, just trying to spook each other. But as the night grew darker, I couldn't shake this eerie feeling that we weren't alone, that someone, or something, was watching us from just beyond the reach of the firelight. I kept this feeling to myself, not wanting to admit even to myself that I was scared. Eventually, I decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would wash away the unease. But sleep didn't help. The next morning, as we all emerged from the tent, groggy and hungover, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. We made breakfast, tried to keep things light, but the atmosphere had shifted. We decided to explore the woods, hiking through the dense trees, trying to recapture the carefree spirit of the previous day. But as the day wore on, and especially as we went out on the lake again to fish, that feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. This time, I couldn't keep it to myself. I asked Kevin and Buddha if they felt like we were truly alone. The look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They felt it too. Buddha even admitted he'd been uneasy all night, a confession that sent a shiver through me. As dusk turned to dark, our fears were realized. Across the lake, a light appeared in the woods, small at first, but growing brighter, like a beacon in the night. We watched, frozen, as it seemed to pulse and grow. Kevin whispered, "What the hell is that?" But I had no answers. My head started spinning, and the last thing I remember was a rush of dizziness, then darkness. I woke up back in the tent the next morning, with no memory of how I got there. Kevin and Buddha were already awake, looking just as confused and scared as I felt. My side ached fiercely, and when I lifted my shirt, I saw a small scar that I didn't remember getting. Kevin and Buddha checked themselves and found they had similar marks. We didn't know what had happened, but we knew we had to leave. We packed up as fast as we could, not bothering to investigate or understand what might have happened. We just needed to get away. We've never spoken of it since, not until now. I don't know if sharing this will help, but maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Maybe someone who can offer an explanation or at least confirm that we're not crazy. That's all I want, to know we aren't alone in what we experienced. The drive back from Allegheny National Forest was filled with silence. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of the inexplicable events we had just experienced. We arrived home early, exhausted and troubled, yet none of us dared to speak about what had happened. Not to each other, not to our families. It was as if by acknowledging it aloud, the fear and confusion would solidify, becoming too real to dismiss. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying every moment of that night over and over in my mind. The mysterious light across the lake, the sudden dizziness, the blackout, and waking up with no memory of how we returned to our tent. All these details haunted me. The scars on our sides, so similar and so precisely placed, seemed to throb with a reminder of the night's terror. I researched online, desperate for any clue that might explain our experience, but found nothing that came close. College started, and Kevin, Buddha, and I went our separate ways. We stayed in touch, but the unspoken agreement to never discuss that night remained intact. It was as if each of us feared that bringing it up would somehow break the fragile hold we had on our sanity. Life moved on, and we slowly adapted to our new routines, yet the shadows of that summer lingered. One night, during a break, I visited Buddha at his university. After a few drinks, our conversation slowly veered toward the past, inching closer to the subject we had all avoided. Finally, breaking years of silence, Buddha looked at me and whispered, "Do you ever think about that night?" His voice was barely audible over the hum of the bar, but his words struck me with the force of a thunderclap. We stepped outside, needing the cold air to brace ourselves for a conversation filled with more questions than answers. "Every day," I admitted, feeling a mix of relief and dread at finally talking about it. Buddha nodded, his face pale under the streetlights. "I do too," he confessed, "and I think we need to go back. We need answers." The decision to return to that same spot in the Allegheny National Forest was not made lightly. We planned it for the following summer, wanting to ensure we were as prepared as possible. We researched more about the area, spoke anonymously with other campers online, and even looked into folklore and local legends. Nothing matched our experience exactly, but the stories of strange lights and unexplained phenomena in those woods convinced us we weren't alone in our encounter. Finally, the day came. Armed with more sophisticated equipment, including night vision cameras and GPS trackers, we returned to the exact place where it all happened. The familiar landscape brought back a rush of memories, and as night fell, a palpable tension settled over us. We set up camp with military precision, every detail meticulously planned to ensure our safety and to maximize our chances of capturing anything unusual on camera. As darkness enveloped the forest, we sat by the fire, much like we had years before. But this time our eyes constantly scanned the tree-line, and our hands were never far from our equipment. Hours passed without incident, and I could feel the thread of hope that we might find some answers slowly fraying. But then, just as we began to relax, it happened. The light appeared again across the lake, its eerie glow pulsating softly in the distance. This time, we were ready. We recorded everything, our cameras trained on the mysterious light as we tried to approach it cautiously. As we neared the source of the light, a dense fog seemed to rise from nowhere, enveloping us in a thick, damp mist. The light flickered, retreated, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. We stood there, in the middle of the mist, our cameras capturing nothing but the white haze around us. Frustrated and chilled to the bone, we returned to our campsite. The footage revealed little, just the light in the distance and then the fog.
No concrete answers, no explanations.
But as we packed up to leave the next day, a sense of closure settled over us. We might not have solved the mystery, but we had faced it together. Since then, we've continued our lives, the bond between us forged even stronger by our shared quest for answers. The scars on our sides have faded into faint lines, but the memory of those nights in the Allegheny forest remains vivid. We may never fully understand what happened, but somehow, returning to that place, acknowledging our fear, and seeking answers together has given us a sense of peace. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder about the light and the fog. Are there some mysteries that are simply meant to remain unsolved? Perhaps, but I know this. Whatever it was, it has changed us, and we have grown from the experience, more aware of the world's vast and unexplained mysteries, and more appreciative of the bonds of friendship that can help us face even the most inexplicable fears. The moment I tossed my graduation cap into the air, I knew I needed something more substantial than confetti and cheers to mark the end of my college journey. With a degree in environmental science in hand and a heart hungry for adventure, I decided to immerse myself deep into the untamed wilderness, not of Canada, but of the vast, often overlooked expanse of northern Minnesota. The Boundary Waters, a place where the water is as clear as the skies are vast, seemed like a fitting place to rediscover myself and reflect on my future. It was mid-June when I packed up my old, reliable Jeep with the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and a couple of disposable cameras. Digital technology was pervasive, but I wanted my journey to be a nod to the past. Those disposable cameras, with their finite number of shots, felt like a metaphor for life. Each picture had to count, just like every decision I was about to make in my new adult life. I drove north from my hometown in Duluth, the landscape changing as cityscapes gave way to expansive forests and then to the rugged beauty of the wilderness. By the time I reached my entry point at Moose Lake, it was as if the rest of the world had fallen away. I was alone, truly alone, save for the occasional distant paddler outlined against the horizon. The first few days were blissful. I paddled from one lake to another. The sound of my oars slicing through the water was the only disruption in the serene quiet. Eagles soared overhead, and at night, the sky was a tapestry of stars so vivid it took my breath away. I captured it all on my cameras: the sunsets, the early morning mists, the way the light danced through the trees. But as much as I was engrossed in the beauty of the wilderness, a part of me remained alert, on edge. It's one thing to revel in solitude. It's another to be acutely aware that help is miles and hours away should anything go wrong. On the 7th day, I set up camp on a small, isolated island on Knife Lake. It was a spot that seemed pulled from a storybook, perfect for reflecting and, hopefully, for deciding what came next in life. After a simple dinner of rehydrated food, I nestled into my sleeping bag, the exhaustion from the day's paddle mixed with a profound peace as I drifted off to sleep, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore a soothing lullaby. The next morning, I packed up early and made my way back. The journey home was quiet, contemplative. Upon returning, one of my first stops was the local photo development store, a relic in itself, where I dropped off my cameras full of what I expected would be my new treasured memories. A week later, I picked up the photos. Flipping through them, I was transported back to those tranquil lakes and silent forests, each image a reminder of solitude and serenity, until I reached the halfway point on the first camera's roll. There, amidst my carefully curated memories, were two pictures that made my blood run cold. They showed me, asleep in my tent, utterly vulnerable, wrapped in my sleeping bag. The shock was visceral. My hands shook as I stared at the images. Who? How? The questions spiraled in my mind, each more frantic than the last. I had never felt the presence of another person out there, never heard a branch snap under the weight of an unseen foot, never noticed a boat too close for comfort. Yet, someone had been there, close enough to capture these deeply personal moments without waking me. The discovery cast a dark shadow over my memories of the trip. My sense of peace was replaced by paranoia. For weeks, I struggled to sleep, my nights punctuated by the slightest sounds, each one a reminder of the unseen visitor in the boundary waters. Last week, something happened that both shook my sense of reality and reaffirmed a long-standing personal truth. I am decidedly not a nature person. However, my wife, Carly, is the opposite. Her idea of paradise is anywhere filled with more trees than people. She's the type who can find the song in a whispering wind and the story in a soaring mountain. So, when she proposed a camping trip, her eyes sparkling with the mere thought, how could I say no? "We should go camping," she exclaimed one evening, her excitement practically bubbling over. I nodded, masking my reluctance with a smile. Sure, let's do it. And that's how we found ourselves packing up our SUV the following Saturday morning, bound for a piece of secluded land my parents own, a quiet retreat nestled deep in the heart of the woods. We spent the early hours of the morning loading up the car with all the essentials. A tent, a cooler filled with enough snacks and drinks to last us through a minor apocalypse, and much to my dismay, absolutely no cell service. The drive was scenic, tranquil even, with roads that meandered through lush landscapes and under canopies of ancient trees. It was picturesque, sure, but as someone who prefers the concrete jungle, it was just a tad too isolated for my taste. By the time we arrived, the sun was high and assertive. We spent a couple of hours setting up our temporary home, pitching the tent with its stubborn poles, laying out our sleeping bags, and organizing our makeshift kitchen. Once our campsite looked somewhat respectable, Carly clapped her hands together, her enthusiasm undimmed. "Let's go hiking," she suggested, already heading towards the trail that cut through the dense woods surrounding us. I followed, my steps less eager. The beauty of the wilderness was undeniable. The way the sunlight dappled through the leaves, the chorus of birds and rustling branches, the air fresh and crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. It was a paradise for Carly. For me, it was an endless array of bugs, each seemingly more enthusiastic about my presence than the last. Despite my discomfort, we hiked for hours, losing track of time until a gentle drizzle prompted us to turn back. As we retraced our steps, the woods seemed to grow denser, the shadows longer, and the path more winding. By the time we reached our campsite, dusk was settling in, cloaking everything in a soft, eerie twilight. "We made it just in time," Carly said, her cheeks flushed from the walk. "Let's start a fire. I'm ready for some roasted marshmallows." The idea of a fire was comforting. The crackling flames, the warmth pushing back the chill of the evening, the golden marshmallows turning to gooey perfection. It was all very cozy. We spent the night swapping stories, some funny, some spooky, laughing and huddling close. However, as the night deepened, Carly grew quiet, her laughter fading. I glanced over to see her shivering despite the fire's warmth. "You okay?" I asked, concerned. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her teeth chattered slightly. "Are you sure? You don't look too good," I pressed, noting the paleness of her skin. "It's nothing," she insisted, "probably just tired." But it wasn't nothing. As the hours passed, her shivering worsened, and I finally insisted on feeling her forehead. It was burning up. You have a fever," I said, my decision made. "We need to head back." She looked disappointed, almost guilty. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to ruin our trip." "I'm more than ready to leave," I admitted, only half joking. We began to pack up in haste. As I was dismantling the tent, a sudden blare of the car horn startled me. I ran over to find Carly pale and wide-eyed. "I saw someone in the trees," she whispered hoarsely, pointing shakily towards the dark forest. "It looked like a person, but when they moved," her voice trailed off, terror taking the place of explanation. I was skeptical. Probably just an animal, I reasoned. But as I turned back to finish packing, her scream cut through the night, chilling and clear. "Clark, help! My leg!" Heart pounding, I dashed out of the tent, my eyes scanning the dark woods. Then I saw her, sleeping peacefully in the car. Confusion gripped me, but before I could process it, another cry echoed, this time from behind me. "Help me, Clark, please." The voice was hers and yet not, raspy, desperate. In that moment, a visceral fear took hold. I grabbed what I could and threw it into the back of the car. The tent was left behind, forgotten in my frantic escape. As we sped away, Carly recounted what she had seen. A pale figure, almost inhuman, watching from the shadows. It was enough to convince me of one thing. Nature and I were not meant to be friends. We drove through the night, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides, the only light coming from the car's headlamps cutting through the fog. The silence between us was heavy, filled with our ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart. Carly remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing shadows, a stark contrast to her earlier vibrancy. Once home, safe within the walls of our familiar surroundings, the tension began to ebb, but the unease lingered like a bad taste. As we sat on our couch, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of our house, Carly finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It was standing there, just at the edge of the clearing," she recounted, her eyes distant. "When it heard the horn, it sort of crumpled and then scurried away." Last summer, my buddies and I decided we needed a break from the daily grind of our tech jobs in Portland, Oregon. There's something about nature that just resets your soul, you know? So, we planned a weekend camping trip alongside the serene Silver Falls, deep within the woodlands of Oregon. The idea was simple: disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature, and maybe knock back a few beers in the process. There were 4 of us: me, Eli, Ben, and Carter. Eli, with his endless collection of flannel shirts and a beard that made him look like a modern-day mountain man, was our unofficial guide. Ben, the joker of the group, always had a way of turning every situation into a laugh fest. Then there was Carter, who could always be counted on to bring more gadgets than we could possibly need. Even on a camping trip, we set out late Friday afternoon, the trunk of my old Jeep loaded with camping gear, enough food to feed a small army, and of course, a cooler packed with local craft beer. The drive to Silver Falls was a mix of classic rock tunes and the guys arguing about whether Bigfoot was just a myth or a master of hide and seek. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the treeline, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We found a secluded spot near the river, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the gentle flow of water. It was perfect. We set up our tents quickly, Eli and Ben in one, Carter and I in the other. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire. Eli took charge of the grill, sizzling up some steaks while Ben curated the perfect playlist of wilderness vibes on his portable speaker. We shared stories and jokes, the kind of deep conversations that only seem to happen against the backdrop of a crackling fire under a sky full of stars. I remember looking around at my friends, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the firelight, or maybe it was the beers, but everything seemed hilariously funny, and for a moment, all our work stress seemed miles away. It was well past midnight when we decided to call it a night. The others were fading fast, but the sound of laughter kept echoing through the trees. At first, it was just part of the night's background noise, mixed with the occasional owl hoot or the distant rush of the river. But then, it started to get closer, louder, more distinct. Lying in the tent, I nudged Carter. "You hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, half asleep. "Probably just Ben messing with us," he murmured. But the laughter didn't sound like Ben. It was deeper, almost manic, and it didn't sound like it was coming from either of the tents. It was out there, in the darkness of the woods. The more I listened, the clearer it became. A single voice, laughing without pause, growing louder as if it were approaching our campsite. Carter finally sat up, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by a look of concern. "Okay, that's not Ben," he said, reaching for his flashlight. We heard Eli shout from the other tent, "Knock it off, guys. It's not funny anymore." But we weren't the ones laughing. The 4 of us met outside the tents, the beam of our flashlights slicing through the night. The laughter was so close now, it felt like it was right on the edge of our campsite. We couldn't see anyone, but the laughter was all around us. No footsteps, no rustling bushes, just laughter that chilled to the bone. "What the hell is that?" Ben whispered, his usual humor gone. We didn't have an answer. The laughter circled us, a disembodied sound that made the night air feel thick and heavy. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the darkest night. We stood there, frozen, not even daring to breathe. The stillness was broken by a soft, scraping sound against the nylon fabric of our tent. A shadow passed over the moonlit fabric, a hand, pressing down, moving slowly. This was too much. In a collective surge of panic, we tore out of the campsite, stumbling through the dark woods, not stopping to look back until we reached the car. Our breaths were ragged, our nerves shot. "We're leaving," I said, the decision unanimous without words. We packed up in record time, leaving behind a cloud of dust as we drove away from Silver Falls, the laughter still echoing in our minds. The sun was just starting to hint at the horizon when we finally stopped. Miles away from the campsite, the early morning silence enveloping us like a cold blanket. None of us spoke much as we drove back to Portland, each lost in his thoughts about the night's eerie events. It was an experience that would linger with us, a haunting reminder of the unknown that lies in the dark, untouched corners of the world.